You should've taken the money. Grant Voss placed the offer on Elias Mercer's old workbench, $100,000 in clean print, wrapped around a threat. Caleb Mercer didn't touch it. Rain hammered the roof, the garage lights flickered. Ranger stood near the back wall, eyes locked on a sheet of plywood Caleb hadn't noticed before. A man like you doesn't need a broken building, Grant said. You need an exit. Caleb looked at the German Shepherd, then at the wall. Funny, he said quietly. My dog seems to think this place still has something to say. Grant smiled then, but only for a second. Because behind that wall was the one thing his family had spent years trying to keep buried. Caleb Mercer came back to Ashford Hollow with a dog in the passenger seat, a letter on the dashboard, and no intention of staying long enough to be remembered. The November sky over northern Maine hung low and colorless, pressing down on the road like a lid. Black spruce crowded both sides of the highway. Their branches, bare in places and heavy in others, scraped at the wind as if trying to warn him away. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and the other near the folded envelope from Cole and Whitcomb Law. He had read the letter so many times the creases had gone soft. Elias Mercer was dead. Mercer and Wren Auto Works now belonged to Caleb. So did the overdue taxes, the old private loan, the cracked pavement, the rusted doors, and whatever else a man could leave behind when he had nothing decent left to give. Beside him, Ranger watched the passing trees without blinking. The German Shepherd was 9 now, gray around the muzzle, broad in the chest, slower in the hips, but his eyes still held that steady, amber intelligence Caleb had trusted in places where trust was not a feeling, but a way to stay alive. Ranger had been trained to notice what men missed. Caleb had been trained to keep moving after he noticed too much. Maybe that was why they understood each other. Neither of them slept well. Neither of them liked crowds. Neither of them knew what to do with peace when it came too quietly. Caleb was 41 years old, a former Army mechanic who had spent half his adult life fixing engines in heat, dust, rain, and noise. He could hear a bad bearing before most men saw smoke. He could rebuild a transmission with patience and a flashlight. But he had never learned how to repair a family story once it had hardened into fact. His father, Daniel Mercer, had made sure of that. Your grandfather chose that garage over us. Daniel used to say, never angry enough to shout, never calm enough to forgive. Elias Mercer could fix anything with wheels, just not what mattered. Caleb had grown up with those words. They were as familiar as the smell of coffee in his father's kitchen, as familiar as the empty chair Daniel never explained. By the time Caleb was old enough to ask questions, his father had become a man who answered the past by leaving the room. So Caleb stopped asking. Years later, after Daniel's heart gave out on a cold morning in Portland, Caleb found himself with a box of old work shirts, a tackle knife, and a silence that had his father's shape. Then came the letter, then the debt, then the key. He had nearly thrown the whole thing away, but Ranger had picked the envelope up from the floor, carried it carefully in his mouth, and placed it at Caleb's boots like an order neither of them could ignore. Now the town appeared through the windshield in tired pieces. A diner with blue neon trembling in the window, a boarded hardware store, a church steeple faded by salt air, a gas station with one working pump and a handwritten sign taped inside the glass. Ashford Hollow looked less abandoned than exhausted, like a man sitting on the edge of his bed after a long illness, trying to remember why he had stood up. Caleb turned onto Hawthorne Road. At the very end, beneath a row of leaning pines, the garage waited. Mercer and Wren Auto Works. The sign hung crooked, its green paint peeled down to gray wood. One bay door sagged. Weeds split the lot. A rusted air hose lay curled near the wall like a thing that had given up halfway home. Caleb parked and let the engine tick itself quiet. For a moment he did not move. He had come to sell the place, that was all. Sell it, pay what he could, walk away from a dead man's mistake. Ranger's ears lifted. Caleb looked at him. Don't make this mean something, he said. Ranger only stared at the garage. Caleb stepped into the cold, unlocked the side door, and pushed it open. Darkness breathed out, thick with oil, dust, rubber, and old rain. Ranger slipped inside first. He did not wander. He went straight past the lift, past the tool cabinets, past the shelves of coffee cans labeled in a careful hand. At the back wall he stopped. His body went still in that old, certain way Caleb knew better than his own pulse. Caleb followed him. The plywood there looked newer than the boards around it, badly fitted, almost hidden by dust. Ranger pressed his nose to it, then looked back. Caleb touched the wall. Hollow. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, something long buried seemed to hold its breath. Caleb had come to Ashford Hollow to get rid of an inheritance. But as his palm rested against that false wall, he felt the first small fracture in the story he had hated all his life. Caleb Mercer had learned, somewhere between his first deployment and his last goodbye to the army, that a man could come home without arriving anywhere. People used to thank him for his service in grocery stores, at gas stations, outside the Veterans Clinic in Portland, and Caleb always answered the same way. Appreciated. 2 words, polite enough to close the door. He never knew what else to say. Thank you for noticing the uniform I no longer wear. Thank you for not asking what it cost. Thank you for seeing the clean version of a thing that was never clean while it was happening. He was 41, tall but not broad in the way younger men tried to be, lean from habit more than pride, with dark hair cut short because long hair still felt like carelessness. A thin line of gray had begun at his temples, and his hands carried the permanent evidence of work. Oil tucked under the nails, small scars across the knuckles, one crooked finger that ached before rain. His face was not hard, exactly. It was guarded. There was a difference, though most people did not stay long enough to learn it. After leaving the service, Caleb took a job maintaining diesel engines for a freight company near the harbor. He liked engines because they were honest. A bad belt squealed. A clogged filter choked. A loose bolt rattled until someone paid attention. Machines did not smile while hiding what was broken. They did not say they were fine. Caleb's apartment sat above a closed print shop on a narrow street where the gulls screamed at dawn and fog softened the brick buildings into gray blocks. There was a bed, a coffee maker, 2 plates, 1 chair, and a stack of unread mail that grew like guilt on the counter. He told himself he lived simply. The truth was smaller and sadder. He had forgotten how to make room for anything that might need him, except Ranger. Ranger had come home with him after his final year attached to a stateside training unit. The dog had served longer than most men Caleb knew, first as a working K9, then as a steadying presence no paperwork could properly describe. Ranger had 1 dark saddle across his back, tan legs, a proud head, and ears that still rose at the smallest change in air. Age had softened his speed but not his judgment. He could tell when Caleb's breathing changed before Caleb felt it himself. On nights when sleep turned sharp and old sounds came back wearing new walls, Ranger would push open the bedroom door and lay his heavy body against the side of the bed. Not demanding, not curing, just there. Sometimes that was the only thing that kept Caleb from getting up and driving until sunrise. Caleb did not call him a service dog in conversation, though technically he was one now. Labels made strangers comfortable. Ranger was not a label. He was the last living witness to the version of Caleb who had believed duty could give a man shape forever. Without him, Caleb suspected, the quiet might have swallowed more than sleep. His father, Daniel, had never understood dogs. Or maybe Daniel had understood them too well and resented what they offered so freely. Loyalty without interrogation, forgiveness without speeches. Daniel Mercer had been a tired man long before sickness took him. He worked warehouse jobs, paid bills late but paid them, kept his truck clean, and carried old anger like a second wallet. The name Elias was almost forbidden in their house. When it did appear, it came with a slammed cabinet, a swallowed curse, or a story cut short at the throat. Caleb knew only the outline. Elias had owned a garage in Ashford Hollow, had driven Daniel away, had let pride do what poverty could not. Daniel left at 19 and never went back. He raised Caleb on half-truths and warnings, not because he was cruel, but because pain had convinced him that silence was protection. Caleb understood that now more than he wanted to. People often passed down what hurt them because they mistook it for wisdom. After Daniel died, Caleb found no letters from Elias, no photographs of the garage, no clear evidence of anything except absence. That absence became simple. Elias had not cared. Daniel had suffered. Caleb had inherited the damage. It was easier that way. Clean lines, no loose wires, no reason to reopen the wall, but standing inside Mercer and Wren Auto Works, with dust in his throat and Ranger fixed on a hollow place behind the lift, Caleb felt that old certainty begin to misfire. The garage did not feel loved, but it did not feel empty either. Someone had labeled every drawer. Someone had swept the corners once. Someone had kept records, saved parts, hung coats on hooks, and locked away something behind plywood where only time or a stubborn old dog might find it. Caleb looked down at Ranger. The shepherd's amber eyes held steady, not pleading, not excited, simply waiting. Caleb knew that look. It meant the mission was not finished. It meant there was something ahead that mattered, whether the man beside him was ready or not. For the first time in years, Caleb felt less like a man returning to a place and more like a man being returned to himself. Ashford Hollow did not welcome Caleb Mercer. It received him the way an old house receives weather, with a shiver in the walls and no promise of warmth. By noon, the clouds had lowered until the hills disappeared behind a gray curtain, and a cold mist drifted off Pineglass Lake, sliding through the streets and gathering along the curbs. Caleb drove slowly through town after leaving the garage, Ranger sitting upright beside him, his nose angled toward the cracked window, as if reading the air for names. The place had the worn look of a town that had once believed in morning whistles and full parking lots. A shuttered mill stood at the edge of the river, its brick walls dark with rain. The movie theater marquee still advertised a summer festival from 3 years back. The hardware store windows had been papered over, but someone had drawn a small smiley face in the dust, a tiny stubborn thing on a street that had mostly forgotten how to smile back. Caleb had seen towns like this all over America. Places not dead enough to mourn and not alive enough to celebrate. Places where people spoke of better days the way some men spoke of lost brothers, carefully, briefly, and only when necessary. The office of Cole and Whitcomb Law sat above the pharmacy on Main Street. Marianne Cole met him at the top of the stairs with a folder tucked against her chest and an expression that was kind without being soft. She was in her late 50s with silver hair cut at her jaw and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Ranger sniffed her hand once, accepted her, and sat near Caleb's boot. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Caleb almost said, "You don't have to be." Instead, he nodded. Her office smelled of paper, lemon polish, and radiator heat. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Ashford Hollow in winter, back when the mill still smoked, and the street outside was crowded with trucks. Marianne laid out the documents with the careful hands of someone who knew bad news should not be rushed. The property was his. The business license had lapsed. The county taxes stood at $18,000 and change. An old private note, transferred twice and now held by Voss Development Group, sat at $32,000 even, not including administrative fees. Caleb looked at the numbers and felt something inside him go still. $50,000. For a building that leaned. For a name he did not want. For a dead man whose silence had outlived him. "Can I refuse it?" he asked. Marianne watched him over the top of her glasses. Legally, yes. Practically, someone else would move quickly. She slid another paper across the desk. "Grant Voss has already made an offer, $95,000 for the property as is. He would assume certain costs at closing." Caleb stared at the clean black print. $95,000. Enough to end this before it became a story. Enough to pay what had to be paid and drive back to Portland with nothing but a bitter afternoon behind him. "Why would he pay that much for a wreck?" Caleb asked. Marianne's mouth tightened just slightly. "The land matters more than the building. Land always does. Around here," she said, "it matters more than people sometimes." The sentence settled between them. Caleb looked down at Ranger, who had turned his head toward the window. Across the street, a man in a wool cap paused outside the diner and looked up at the law office. When he saw Caleb looking back, he turned away too quickly. Caleb had known that kind of look in airports and hospital hallways. The glance people gave when they knew part of your story and had already decided the rest. He signed nothing. Marianne gave him copies, a ring of older keys, and directions to the county office. "There's no hurry today," she said. Caleb gave a dry laugh. $50,000 usually hurries a man. Downstairs, he crossed to the Blue Kettle diner because Ranger stopped outside the door and refused to move. Inside, the diner was warm, smelling of coffee, onions, and pie crust. Conversations thinned when Caleb entered, not stopping entirely, just lowering, as if someone had turned down the volume on the room. Behind the counter stood Nora Whitcomb, a woman with white hair pinned up badly and eyes that had seen enough to be gentle by choice. She looked at Ranger first. "That dog has better manners than half the men who come in here." "He usually does," Caleb said. Nora poured coffee without asking and set a bowl of water near the end stool. You're Daniel's boy, not a question. Caleb's hand tightened around the mug. Caleb. I know. She studied him for a moment, then looked toward the rain-streaked window. Your grandfather used to sit right there every Thursday. Same stool. Black coffee. No sugar. He paid for more meals than he ate. Caleb felt irritation rise, old and automatic. That doesn't sound like the man I heard about. Nora's eyes returned to him, steady but sad. No, I imagine it doesn't. She said nothing more, and somehow the silence felt heavier than an argument. When Caleb left, the mist had thickened. He drove back to Mercer and Wren with the offer folded in his coat pocket like an escape route. He should have felt relieved. Instead, the garage looked different when he pulled in. Not better, only less simple. Ranger jumped down before Caleb could reach for the leash and went straight to the side door, waiting. The dog knew what he wanted. Caleb hated that. He unlocked the door again, and the old building opened with its tired groan. Somewhere inside, behind the lift, behind the false wall, the hollow space waited. So did the choice he had not yet admitted was a choice. The first person in Ashford Hollow who spoke of Elias Mercer like a human being was not a lawyer, not a banker, not anyone with a reason to polish the dead. It was Nora Whitcomb, standing behind the counter of the Blue Kettle Diner, with a coffee pot in one hand and a dish towel over her shoulder, looking at Caleb as if she could see 3 generations of Mercer men standing in the same tired pair of boots. Caleb had returned the next morning because the motel coffee tasted like burnt cardboard, and because Ranger, with the quiet tyranny of old dogs, had pulled him toward the diner door before breakfast. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the place glowed with yellow light and the slow comfort of ordinary things. Forks against plates, a radio murmuring old country songs, bacon hissing on the grill. Ranger settled beneath Caleb's stool, his body warm against Caleb's shin. Your grandfather took his coffee black, Nora said, filling Caleb's mug before he asked. Your father did too, when he was young enough to still come around. Caleb looked up. You knew my father? Nora's face shifted, not away from pain. Exactly, but around it. Everybody knew Daniel. He used to race that old Chevelle up Mill Road like he was trying to outrun his own name. Caleb had never heard that story. His father, in Caleb's memory, belonged to quiet kitchens, late bills, and a pickup that smelled of sawdust and wintergreen. The idea of Daniel Young, reckless, laughing maybe, felt almost disrespectful. He didn't talk about this place, Caleb said. No, Nora replied. Men who leave with a wound don't usually send postcards back to the knife. Caleb felt the words land harder than he wanted them to. He took a drink of coffee to avoid answering. Nora watched the rain slide down the glass. Elias wasn't easy, she said. Don't mistake me. He could be proud enough to make a preacher swear, but hard and heartless aren't the same thing. Caleb let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That's not the version I got. I imagine the version you got had been carrying pain for a long time. Before Caleb could respond, the diner door opened and a thin man in a brown canvas coat stepped in, shaking rain from the brim of his cap. He moved slowly. One hand curled around a cane, but his eyes sharpened the moment they landed on Ranger. The old man stopped as if he had seen a ghost come in on 4 legs. Well, I'll be, he whispered. Nora's expression softened. Morning, Sam. The man came closer, still staring at Ranger. That shepherd yours? Caleb nodded. His name's Ranger. Sam Boone lowered himself carefully into the next stool. His fingers trembled when he reached down, but he did not touch the dog without permission. Ranger lifted his head, studied him, then placed his chin on Sam's knee. The old man's mouth tightened. For a second, Caleb thought he might cry. Elias had one, Sam said. German shepherd, big sable fellow. Mason, smartest creature in this county, including most of the judges. Nora smiled faintly. Caleb looked from Sam to Ranger. My grandfather had a dog? Not had, Sam said. Worked with. There's a difference. He scratched Ranger gently behind the ear. Mason rode shotgun in the service truck. If somebody's car died on a back road in February, Elias and that dog went out. Didn't matter if the person could pay. Didn't matter if they'd spoken badly of him the week before. Elias would grumble the whole way, then fix what needed fixing. Caleb did not like how carefully the story entered him. It found places he had kept locked, places built out of his father's grief and his own loyalty to that grief. Why didn't my father know that version? He asked. Sam's hand stilled. Nora turned away to wipe a counter that was already clean. Because some truths don't survive the people who need them most, Sam said. and because Harold Voss made sure certain stories got told louder than others. The name Voss moved through the diner like a draft under a door. A man in the corner lowered his newspaper. Someone at a back table stopped stirring sugar into coffee. Caleb noticed. Ranger noticed too. His ears lifted. Not alarmed, only attentive. Grant Voss's father? Sam nodded once. Harold owned half the notes in this town by the late 90s. Mortgages, business loans, private liens. If you owed money, you owed Harold. If you crossed him, folks suddenly remembered things about you that may or may not have been true. Caleb thought of the offer in his coat pocket, neat and generous and waiting, and Elias crossed him. Elias refused to sign over a strip of land behind the garage. Sam said land Harold needed. After that, your grandfather became a lot of things in people's mouths. Unreliable, bitter, dangerous to do business with, a man who couldn't be trusted. Caleb's jaw tightened. My father believed that. Sam looked at him with a tired mercy. Your father was young. Hurt makes a poor judge, but a powerful witness. For a while, nobody spoke. Rain worked softly at the windows. The grill hissed. Ranger breathed against Sam's knee as though holding the old man in place. Caleb looked around the diner and saw, for the first time, not a town hiding from him, but a town hiding from itself. People knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not enough. But they knew the old story had cracks in it. Outside, the clouds hung low over Main Street, and across town Mercer and Wren sat waiting with its hollow wall and its sealed silence. Caleb had come looking for a reason to leave quickly. Instead, Ashford Hollow had given him the first dangerous thing: doubt. That night, the rain turned colder. It slid down the windows of Mercer and Wren Auto Works in long, trembling lines and gathered along the cracked concrete outside where the old gutters coughed and overflowed. Caleb had meant to leave before dark. He had told himself that twice while standing in the office with a flashlight between his teeth, looking through drawers full of brittle receipts, inspection stickers, parts catalogs, and paper clips sorted into baby food jars. But the storm thickened, the road back to the motel blurred under fog, and the heater in his pickup began making a dry clicking sound that even Caleb did not feel like diagnosing in the dark, so he stayed. He found an army cot folded behind the office door, shook out a wool blanket that smelled of dust and cedar, and made himself a bed beneath a framed calendar from 2008. Ranger lay near the doorway, not quite asleep, his ears shifting every time the building answered the weather with an old wooden groan. The garage felt different at night. In daylight, it was just neglected. At night, it became watchful. Tools cast long bent shadows across the floor. The lift stood like a sleeping animal. Rain tapped the metal roof in uneven rhythms. And somewhere in the walls, the wind found small openings and whispered through them. Caleb tried not to think about Nora's voice, or Sam Boone's shaking hand resting on Ranger's head, or the name Harold Voss landing in the diner like a match dropped near gasoline. He tried not to think about Elias riding out in snow with a German shepherd named Mason to help people who could not pay. He tried not to think about his father as a young man in a Chevelle, racing up Mill Road not yet tired, not yet closed. Thinking was dangerous in quiet places. It gave the dead room to speak. Near midnight, Ranger stood. Caleb woke before he opened his eyes. Old habit. He listened, rain, wind, the soft tick of cooling pipes. Then Ranger gave one low sound from deep in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl. A notice. Caleb sat up. What is it? Ranger walked to the back of the garage, moving stiffly but with purpose, his nails clicking against concrete. Caleb pulled on his boots, grabbed the flashlight, and followed. The dog stopped at the same plywood patch behind the second lift. He sniffed along the bottom edge, then pressed his shoulder against the wall and looked back at Caleb with that infuriating patience that meant the answer was obvious if the human would only catch up. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Caleb muttered. Ranger blinked once. Caleb set the flashlight on a toolbox, found a pry bar hanging near a row of wrenches, and worked the tip under the first board. The wood resisted, damp, swollen, and stubborn. He leaned his weight into it. The nail gave with a sharp cry. Then another. Then another. Piece by piece, the patched wall loosened until a narrow black seam appeared behind it, breathing out colder air than the room around him. Caleb stopped. His pulse had changed. He hated that Ranger heard it. The dog stepped closer, not ahead of him, beside him. Caleb pulled the final board free. Behind the wall was not a closet, not exactly. It was a small room built between the office and the rear storage bay, hidden by bad carpentry and time. Dust lay thick over everything: a workbench, a metal chair, a small green safe, cardboard boxes stacked carefully, an old coat hanging from a hook, dark blue with a stitched name over the pocket. E. Mercer. Caleb stood very still. The air inside smelled sealed, stale, faintly of oil and paper. He swept the flashlight across the bench and found a coffee mug with a brown ring dried at the bottom, as if the man who drank from it had meant to return before it cooled. Beside it sat a tin box, the kind cookies came in around Christmas, its lid taped shut. Ranger moved to the coat and sniffed it. Then he lowered his head toward something on the floor, a leather collar. Cracked with age, the brass tag dulled but readable under the light. Mason. Caleb crouched slowly and picked it up. The leather was stiff in his hands. He did not know why the sight of a dead dog's collar should move him, but it did. Maybe because love often survives in objects too small to defend themselves. Maybe because Ranger stood beside him, gray-muzzled and breathing, and Caleb suddenly understood that Elias had once known this same quiet companionship, this same wordless loyalty that asked for nothing and gave everything. On the workbench lay an envelope yellowed at the edges. Caleb saw his own last name before he saw anything else. Written across the front in a hand that had trembled but not failed were the words, "For Daniel's son, if he ever comes home." Caleb felt the garage tilt around him. Daniel's son, not Caleb, not heir, not stranger, Daniel's son. He opened the envelope carefully, almost angrily, because gentleness felt like surrender. Inside was a folded letter, several photographs, and a key smaller than the others on Mary Ann's ring. Caleb unfolded the letter. "My name is Elias Mercer," it began, "and if you are reading this, then I failed to get the truth where it needed to go while I was alive." Caleb lowered himself onto the metal chair. Ranger sat beside him, close enough that his shoulder touched Caleb's knee. The rain kept working at the roof. The old garage held its breath. Caleb read on. Elias wrote of Daniel, of pride, of mistakes, but not the kind Caleb expected. He wrote of Harold Voss, of land papers, of pressure dressed up as business, of letters sent and returned, of a son turned away by a story someone else had sharpened. He did not beg to be forgiven. Somehow that made it worse. He only asked that the lie not be allowed to live forever. At the bottom of the page, one sentence had been underlined twice. "If you are reading this, then the lie lasted longer than I did. Please don't let it outlive you too." Caleb read the line once, then again. His throat tightened in a place grief had not touched for years. Ranger rested his chin on Caleb's boot. In that hidden room, among dust, old paper, and the collar of a dog named Mason, Caleb realized the inheritance was not the garage. Not really. The inheritance was a question, and for the first time he was afraid the answer might ask something of him. By morning, the storm had passed, but the garage still felt wet with secrets. Pale light pressed through the high windows of Mercer and Wren Auto Works, turning the dust in the air silver. Caleb had not slept again after reading Elias's letter. He had sat in the hidden room until the words blurred, the paper softening beneath his fingers. Ranger stretched across the doorway like a guard posted between the past and whatever came next. Now, with coffee from a gas station cooling on the office desk, Caleb stood before the old green safe and turned the small key he had found in the envelope. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lock gave with a dull click, so final in the quiet that Caleb felt it behind his ribs. Inside were more papers, a bundle of photographs, and a handwritten inventory of vehicles once stored in the garage. One line had been circled in black pencil. 1972 Chevrolet Chevelle, blue, Daniel's Project. Do not release. Caleb read it twice. Daniel's Project. Not Elias, not abandoned inventory, his father's. He looked across the garage toward the far corner, where a long shape sat under a canvas tarp, half buried behind stacked tires and old brake drums. Ranger was already standing beside it. Of course he was. Caleb crossed the floor slowly. The tarp was stiff with age, dust rising as he pulled it back. The Chevelle emerged in pieces of memory he did not own. Faded blue paint, chrome dulled but intact, one missing hubcap. A cracked windshield bearing the ghost of an old inspection sticker. It was beautiful in the way neglected things can be beautiful when someone once loved them thoroughly. Caleb rested his hand on the hood. Cold metal. A faint smell of gasoline and old vinyl. He could almost see his father at 17, sleeves rolled, hair falling in his eyes, arguing with Elias over timing belts and carburetors, believing there would be enough years to finish everything that mattered. The thought made Caleb angry. Not at Daniel, not exactly, at time maybe, at pride. At all the small doors families close because opening them would require someone to say they were hurt. Ranger sniffed along the passenger side, then pawed gently at the door. Caleb opened it. The hinges complained. The interior smelled like dust, mouse nests, and sun-baked plastic. Ranger placed his front paws on the floorboard and pushed his nose beneath the passenger mat. Caleb leaned in, lifted the brittle rubber, and found a seam cut so cleanly into the metal that he would have missed it in a brighter mood. A hidden compartment. He used a flathead screwdriver from his pocket and pried it open. Inside lay a canvas pouch, a stack of letters tied with twine, a cassette tape in a cracked case, and an envelope thick enough to matter. Caleb opened the envelope first. $12,000 banded in neat hundreds and fifties, older bills but clean. A note sat on top in Elias's careful hand. For the day someone honest needs to start again. Caleb sat back on his heels. It was not fortune. It was not rescue. It was just enough to make leaving a choice instead of a reflex. Ranger watched him from the seat, amber eyes steady. "You knew," Caleb said quietly, though of course the dog had known nothing a man could explain. The letters were addressed to Daniel Mercer in Portland. Most unopened, all stamped return to sender. Caleb untied them with clumsy fingers. Some were apologies, some were explanations, some were ordinary, painfully ordinary. Elias asking whether Daniel still liked black coffee, whether the Chevelle should be kept blue or painted green, whether Caleb, as a boy, had ever learned to change oil. Caleb stopped at that one. His name, written by a grandfather he had been taught to hate, looked strange on the page. Not cursed, not distant, wanted. The cassette tape was labeled Danny, summer before he left. There was an old player on a shelf in the office, half hidden beneath manuals. Caleb found batteries in a drawer, corroded but usable after he scraped the contacts clean. When he pressed play, static hissed first. Then a young man's laugh filled the office. Caleb froze. He had never heard his father laugh like that, not once. The voice that followed was Daniel's and not Daniel's. Lighter, rough with youth, alive in a way Caleb's memory could not hold. "Dad says the Chevelle will run by August if I stop complaining and start listening," the young Daniel said. Another voice answered in the background, deeper, dry with amusement. "Elias, I said it'll run when you learn the difference between confidence and guessing." Daniel laughed again. The sound broke something small and private in Caleb. The tape went on, tools clinking, a radio playing softly, father and son teasing each other about paint colors, road trips, a future that still had both of them in it. Then Daniel's voice, closer to the recorder, lower now. "Maybe we'll drive down the coast after graduation. Just me and Dad. Maybe we need that." Caleb stared at the machine until the office blurred. His father had not been born bitter. His grandfather had not been born a ghost. They had been two men in a garage, talking over an engine, trying in their flawed way to love each other, before someone turned misunderstanding into history. Ranger came to him then, pressing his head under Caleb's hand. Caleb did not cry the way people did in movies. Nothing clean broke open. He only bowed his head and breathed through a pain so old it felt inherited. For the first time, he understood that his father's anger had not been proof. It had been a wound speaking in the only language it had left. And Elias's silence had not been indifference. It had been a message trapped behind walls, inside cars, beneath dust, waiting for someone stubborn enough or loyal enough to find it. Grant Voss arrived at Mercer and Wren a little after 10, when the morning light had finally burned the mist off Hawthorne Road and turned the puddles in the lot into dull pieces of sky. Caleb heard the car before he saw it, not because it was loud, but because it was too smooth for the place. A black Lincoln rolled between the weeds and stopped beside the cracked concrete pad, as if it had lowered itself carefully into poverty and disliked the feeling. The man who stepped out wore a charcoal overcoat, polished shoes, and the calm expression of someone who had never wondered whether a bill could wait until Friday. He was about Caleb's age, maybe a few years older, with pale eyes, neat blonde hair, and a smile that arrived before warmth had been invited. Ranger stood just inside the open bay door. He did not bark. That Caleb had learned was sometimes worse. "Mr. Mercer," the man called, extending a hand as he crossed the lot. "Grant Voss. I hope I'm not interrupting." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, though they were not especially dirty. "You are." Grant's smile widened by one polite inch. I'll be brief then. He glanced past Caleb into the garage, taking in the sagging shelves, the old Chevelle under its half-folded tarp, the dust, the tools, the stubborn remains of another man's life. His expression did not change, but Caleb saw the calculation pass behind his eyes. Men like Grant did not look at places. They measured them. I understand Marianne gave you my offer, Grant said. $95,000. As is, I assume, all closing complications, you walk away clean. The word irritated Caleb more than it should have. That what this place looks like to you? Dirt? Grant gave a soft laugh, designed to forgive the question before answering it. It looks like liability, aging structure, lapsed license, back taxes, environmental concerns, possibly. I'm trying to spare you a headache. Generous, practical. Grant stepped closer to the bay door. Ranger moved once, only enough to place himself between the man and the Chevelle. Grant noticed. His smile held, but it thinned. Beautiful dog. He decides that. Military? Caleb did not answer. Grant took the silence as permission to continue. Look, I respect service. My father always did too. Men like you deserve an easier road after giving so much. That's why I wanted to make this simple. There it was, the soft glove over the hard hand. Caleb had heard versions of it before. Admiration used as a leash. Gratitude shaped into a suggestion that he should step aside quietly and be thankful. What's your plan for the land? Caleb asked. Grant turned toward the rear property line, where pines rose behind the garage. Storage units at first. Maybe a distribution facility later, depending on zoning. Jobs, tax revenue, progress. This town can't survive on nostalgia and brake pads. Caleb looked at him. People still drive cars. People everywhere drive cars. They don't need this garage. The sentence landed coldly, not because it was cruel in volume, but because it was careless in essence. Grant meant it. The customers Caleb had seen at the diner, the old trucks in gravel driveways, the nurses, mechanics, retirees, delivery drivers, men and women stretching paychecks across a month that always had too many days. None of them existed in his sentence except as obstacles to a cleaner spreadsheet. Grant glanced toward the office. My advice, don't get sentimental. Elias did, and it cost him. Caleb's grip tightened around the rag. Ranger's ears lifted. You knew my grandfather. Everyone knew Elias. Grant's voice cooled a degree. He was difficult, proud, couldn't adapt. My father tried to help him see reason, but some men mistake stubbornness for honor. Caleb thought of the hidden room, Mason's collar, the letters returned to sender. His father's young laugh trapped on tape like a bird under glass. Funny, Caleb said. I've been hearing a lot about men who helped by taking things. Grant's eyes sharpened, just briefly. Then the smile came back, smoother than before. Small towns are built on rumors. Be careful which ones you adopt. He reached into his coat and handed Caleb a cream-colored envelope. Revised offer, $100,000. It expires Friday at noon. Caleb did not take it. Grant set it on the workbench instead. After that, I let the county process move along. Inspections, code reviews, debt filings, nothing personal, just procedures. The word procedures sounded almost gentle, which made it uglier. Grant looked down at Ranger, who had not moved his gaze from him. You know, a place like this can become a burden quickly, especially for someone still settling back into civilian life. Caleb felt heat rise in his chest, but it did not become anger the way it once might have. Ranger was there, steady as a post in deep ground, reminding him with silence that not every provocation deserved motion. Caleb folded the rag once. Then again, I'll read it. Grant nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. Do. And ask yourself what your grandfather's pride actually bought him. He turned back to the Lincoln, shoes avoiding the deeper cracks in the lot. When the car finally pulled away, the garage seemed to exhale. Caleb picked up the envelope and stared at it. $100,000, a clean exit, a simple answer. Behind him, Ranger walked to the hidden room and sat at the threshold, not demanding, waiting. Caleb slipped the offer into his coat but did not leave. Outside, Ashford Hollow went on with its tired morning, people driving old trucks to jobs that barely held, carrying groceries, coffee, prescriptions, quiet worries. Grant Voss called it progress to erase places like this. Caleb was beginning to understand that sometimes dignity needed a roof, a lift, a working heater, and somebody willing to say, not everything old is worthless, and not every person struggling is in the way. Caleb spent the next morning trying to convince himself that a man could do the right thing by leaving. He spread the papers across Elias's old desk. Grant Voss's offer, the tax notice, the private note, Marianne's list of deadlines, the $12,000 from the Chevelle, still inside its canvas pouch like a secret with weight. Ranger lay beneath the desk, his chin on his paws, watching Caleb's boots move from one side of the office to the other. "Don't look at me like that," Caleb said. Ranger blinked slowly. Caleb picked up Grant's offer again, $100,000, a clean number, a round number, the kind of number that let a man sleep if he did not ask what it had purchased from him. He could sign, pay off what mattered, return to Portland, fix diesel engines, walk Ranger at dawn, keep his life narrow and manageable. The plan was not noble, but it was survivable, and Caleb had spent enough years respecting survival to know it deserved more credit than people gave it. Then an old Ford pickup coughed into the lot and died 15 feet from the bay door. Caleb looked through the dusty window. A woman climbed out slowly, bracing one hand on the doorframe. She was in her 70s, small but upright, wearing a navy coat buttoned wrong at the top and rain boots too large for her feet. Her silver hair had escaped its pins in soft wisps. She stood beside the truck for a moment, as if apologizing to it for asking too much. Ranger rose before Caleb did. "We're not open," Caleb muttered, but the dog was already moving toward the bay. The woman peered inside. "I'm sorry to bother you," she called. "I saw the door open." Caleb stepped out, wiping his hands though he had touched nothing mechanical all morning. "Shop's closed," I figured. She smiled, embarrassed but not defeated. "I'm Elaine Porter. My husband used to bring this truck here when Elias was alive. I wouldn't have come, but it stalled twice on the way to the care home, and I need it running by tomorrow if possible." Caleb felt the word "no" form easily, almost gratefully. It would have been reasonable. He was not licensed. He had no insurance current. He had enough trouble without adopting someone else's failing engine. Then Ranger walked to Elaine and pressed his head gently against her knee. Elaine looked down, startled. Her hand settled on the shepherd's head with the careful tenderness people reserve for old dogs and old grief. "Well, aren't you something?" she whispered. Caleb looked away. There was a cruelty in being witnessed by kindness when you were trying to stay selfish for practical reasons. "Pop the hood," he said. "I can take a look, no promises." The truck was a 1998 Ford F-150, green once, now mostly memory and rust. Caleb found a cracked vacuum line, a dirty throttle body, and a battery terminal so corroded it looked furred with salt. Nothing heroic, nothing cinematic, just neglect, age, and a machine trying to do its job after too many winters. Elaine stood nearby, hands folded around her purse strap. "Elias used to say this truck had a stubborn soul," she said. "He said that about people too?" Caleb asked. Elaine smiled faintly, mostly about himself. Caleb worked in silence. Ranger settled beside the open bay door, watching Main Street in the distance. After half an hour, the engine turned over with a rough complaint, then steadied. Elaine put one hand to her mouth, not dramatic, just relief, quiet and immediate, the kind that made Caleb understand the truck was not transportation in the abstract. It was visiting her husband. It was groceries. It was winter appointments. It was independence held together by clamps and clean terminals. "What do I owe you?" she asked. Caleb hesitated. He thought of the offer on the desk. He thought of Grant saying people here did not need this garage. $20 for parts, he said. "And coffee someday, if this place ever opens." Elaine studied him, and Caleb had the uncomfortable feeling she saw more than the invoice. "Your grandfather did that too," she said. "Made it possible for folks to keep their pride." Pride. The word had always been ugly in Caleb's family, something that ruined men and split homes. But Elaine used it differently. Not arrogance, dignity. The right to stand straight even when asking for help. After she drove away, the garage seemed less dead. The sound of that old Ford fading down Hawthorne Road remained in the air like a small engine still running somewhere inside him. By afternoon, Nora arrived with coffee and a broom. Sam Boone came with a toolbox older than Caleb. Marianne stopped by with forms for a temporary business filing, and a look that suggested she had expected this before Caleb did. One by one, people appeared. Not a crowd, nothing grand. A retired electrician offered to check the breaker panel. A nurse from the clinic asked if Caleb could look at her squealing brakes later in the week. A mail carrier left a box of old invoices he had found in his garage, saying Elias had saved his root truck twice in one winter. Nobody made speeches. They just came, bringing what they had: tools, memory, labor, coffee, names. Caleb wanted to tell them he had not decided anything. But by sunset, he was sanding the old sign while Sam labeled drawers and Nora washed the office windows. Ranger lay in the center of the bay, like he had claimed the place for all of them. Caleb found a piece of chalk and wrote beneath the old service board, "We fix what gets people home." He stared at the sentence for a long time. It was not a business plan. It would not satisfy the county or scare Grant Voss, but it was the first honest thing he had written in years. That night, Caleb folded Grant's offer and put it in the bottom drawer of Elias's desk. He did not tear it up. He was not foolish. But he did not sign it either. Some choices did not arrive as thunder. Some came as an old woman's truck starting, a dog leaning into a stranger's hand, and a room full of people treating a broken place like it still deserved to stand. By the time the town meeting came, Caleb had learned that truth did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like dust being wiped from an old window, slowly, unevenly, showing first a corner, then a shape, then a whole room a man had been living beside without seeing. For 3 days, he and Marianne Cole sat in the office of Mercer and Wren with Elias's notebooks spread across the desk, the floor, and 2 folding chairs Sam Boone had dragged in from storage. Ranger lay under the desk with his head on Caleb's boot, as if anchoring him there whenever the old anger rose too fast. The records were not dramatic at first glance: loan dates, parcel numbers, repair invoices, names of neighbors who had paid in installments or eggs or firewood or not at all. But between those ordinary lines, Elias had kept careful notes about Harold Voss. Pressure to sell the rear strip of land, returned letters to Daniel, sudden changes in loan terms, inspection complaints filed weeks after Elias refused to sign. Marianne read everything twice, her lips pressed thin. "This may not undo every transaction," she said quietly, "but it is enough to stop Grant from calling this simple." Caleb looked at the Chevelle, its faded blue hood catching the weak afternoon light. Nothing about this had ever been simple. The meeting was held Friday evening in Ashford Hollow Town Hall, a white clapboard building with a bell tower and radiators that knocked like old bones. Caleb arrived with Ranger at his side, carrying a banker's box filled with Elias's ledgers, photographs, the returned letters, Mason's collar, and the cassette tape in a plastic sleeve. People filled the room slowly, avoiding each other's eyes at first. Nora sat near the front. Sam leaned on his cane beside her. Elaine Porter held her purse in both hands like she was bracing herself for weather. Grant Voss stood near the side wall in a navy suit, speaking softly with 2 men Caleb did not know. He looked calm. Of course he did. Calm was easy when the room had been trained to fear your last name. The select board chair opened the meeting by discussing redevelopment, tax revenue, and forward-looking opportunities. Grant stepped forward with polished slides and a polished voice. He spoke of storage facilities, jobs, increased valuation, modern use of underperforming land. He never said garage. He never said Elias. He never said people. When Caleb's turn came, the room seemed to grow smaller around him. He had spoken in briefings before, in motor pools and field offices, but this was different. There was no uniform to hide inside, no rank, no procedure. Just a man with his family's broken story in a cardboard box. Ranger stood beside him, steady and silent. Caleb placed one hand briefly on the dog's head. Then he began. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he said. "I came here to sell my grandfather's garage." A few people shifted. Grant watched without blinking. "I believed Elias Mercer had abandoned my father. I believed that because my father believed it. And my father believed it because a wounded man can mistake a lie for an explanation if he hears it long enough." The room went very still. Caleb did not raise his voice. He opened Elias's notebook and read dates, not accusations. He showed the returned letters to Daniel. He played 30 seconds of the cassette, just enough for Daniel's young laugh to fill the hall and make Sam cover his eyes with one shaking hand. He held up Mason's collar and told them about the hidden room Ranger had found. Then he looked at the people of Ashford Hollow, not over them, not through them, but at them. "I don't think this town forgot the truth all at once," he said. "I think people got tired, scared, busy surviving. I understand that. But maybe a town doesn't die when the mill closes. Maybe it dies when people stop seeing each other as people." The words settled heavily, and this time no one looked away. Elaine stood first. Her voice trembled, but it carried. She told them Elias had kept her old truck running after her husband's first surgery, and refused payment until spring. A retired mail carrier stood next, saying Elias had fixed his route vehicle during a blizzard and left before being thanked. Nora spoke of meals paid for quietly. Sam spoke last, not of business but of Daniel. That boy loved his father, he said, his voice rough, and Elias loved him back. Whatever Harold Voss put between them, shame on every one of us who let it stay there. Grant finally stepped forward, face controlled but pale around the mouth. These are sentimental recollections, he said. Not legal evidence. Marianne rose then, holding copies of the ledgers. Some of it is evidence, Mr. Voss. Enough for a review of the note transfer, the old lien activity, and the current zoning request. I'll be filing Monday. The room changed. Not loudly. There was no cheering, no victory like in films. Just a shift, the quiet sound of people remembering they still had spines. The select board postponed the redevelopment vote pending review. Grant gathered his papers with careful hands. As he passed Caleb, he said softly, "You don't know what you're taking on." Caleb looked down at Ranger, then back at him. "No," he said, "but I know what I'm not selling." Grant left without another word. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light and harmless, touching the steps, the railing, the shoulders of people who lingered instead of hurrying away. Nora squeezed Caleb's arm. Sam nodded once, too full of years to say more. Caleb stood under the yellow porch light with Ranger beside him and felt no triumph, only grief, relief, and the strange weight of a name being handed back cleaner than he had received it. The truth had not fixed everything. It had not returned his father. It had not given Elias the years he lost. But it had done one decent thing. It had stopped the lie from owning the room. Spring came slowly to Ashford Hollow, the way forgiveness often does, not as a sunrise but as a thaw. Snow retreated from the edges of Hawthorne Road in dirty ribbons. Pineglass Lake loosened its gray surface one quiet crack at a time. Water ran beneath the sidewalks, roofs dripped all afternoon, and the town began to smell less like smoke and salt and more like wet earth. Mercer and Wren Auto Works did not become beautiful overnight. The roof still leaked over the back shelf when rain came sideways. The office floor still sloped toward the filing cabinet. The old sign still carried scars where winter and neglect had chewed through the paint, but the lights worked now. The bay doors opened without screaming. The heater coughed, complained, then gave warmth like an old man pretending not to care. And every morning at 7, Caleb unlocked the side door while Ranger waited beside him, tail low, ears up as if the whole place were reporting for duty. At first, Caleb thought reopening the garage would feel like stepping into Elias's life. It didn't. It felt stranger than that. It felt like making room for all the lives that had passed through before him without asking them to disappear. Elias's coat still hung in the hidden room, clean now but left on its hook. Mason's collar rested in a small frame near the front desk beside a photograph Sam had found. Elias, Daniel, and the old German shepherd standing in front of the Chevelle, all three of them squinting into summer light. Caleb kept the cassette tape in the drawer, but some evenings, after the last customer left and the tools were wiped down, he played it once. Not to punish himself, not anymore. To remember that his father had laughed, that mattered. A person should not be remembered only by the wound they carried longest. The review into Voss development moved slowly, wrapped in county language and careful signatures. Grant Voss stopped coming by. His lawyers sent letters. Marianne answered them with colder letters. The town did not transform into a postcard. People still argued at meetings. Bills still came due. The mill remained empty. But something had shifted. Folks began speaking to one another with less hurry and more eye contact, as if Caleb's words in the town hall had not solved anything, but had named something everyone was tired of losing. Elaine Porter brought muffins every Tuesday and insisted they were for Ranger, though Caleb caught Sam eating 2 before noon. Nora kept a coffee pot in the office on Saturdays. A retired electrician rewired the back room and refused payment until Caleb agreed to fix his sister's Subaru. A nurse from the clinic cried quietly when Caleb found a way to make her brakes safe without replacing half the truck. Not because of the money, she said, embarrassed. Because no one had made her feel ashamed for needing help. That sentence stayed with Caleb longer than any thank you. By April, Caleb painted a new line beneath the old garage name, "We fix what gets people home." Under it in smaller letters he added the Mason Fund. It was not a charity, he told anyone who used that word. Charity made some people lower their eyes. The Mason Fund was neighbor work. Customers who could pay a little extra did. Customers who could not pay all at once signed a card and came back when they could. Veterans passing through got coffee, an honest estimate, and if they wanted it, silence that did not need explaining. Older drivers got patience. Shift workers got appointments before dawn or after dark. Nobody was called a problem for arriving with one. Ranger became the quiet center of it all. He slept near the front counter where sunlight warmed the floor. He greeted regulars with a slow tale and strangers with careful judgment. Some people came in with engines that rattled. Some came in with hands that shook before they mentioned their cars. Ranger seemed to know the difference. He offered his head to the lonely, his distance to the proud, and his full weight to Caleb on nights when the old dreams tried the door again. Caleb was still not fixed. He no longer believed people were. Engines could be repaired, tuned, rebuilt. Human beings were more like roads after winter, cracked in places, patched in others, still carrying people forward. On the first warm Sunday in May, Caleb finished the Chevelle. He stood in the open bay with Sam and Nora watching as the engine turned over, coughed once, then caught. The sound filled the garage, deep and imperfect and alive. Sam took off his cap. Nora wiped her eyes and pretended it was dust. Caleb sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting where his father's hands had once rested, where Elias's hands had guided them. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat with some effort and settled there like the place had always belonged to him. They drove out past Main Street, past the diner, past the church, past the old mill, and onto the road that curved along Pine Glass Lake. The window was down. Ranger lifted his muzzle into the wind, gray fur moving softly. Caleb did not say goodbye to the past. That would have been too clean, and life had never respected clean endings. Instead, he let it ride beside him. Elias' silence, Daniel's laugh, Mason's collar, Ranger's steady breathing, the garage lights waiting behind them. He had come to Ashford Hollow to sell an inheritance. What he found was not money, not land, not even justice in the simple way people imagine it. He found a harder gift, a name with pain in it, a truth with responsibility attached. A place where broken things were not thrown away just because they were no longer easy. As the Chevelle followed the Lake Road home, Caleb realized that dignity was not something you handed to people from above. It was something you protected beside them. One honest repair, one patient conversation, one open door at a time. If this story reminded you that broken things and broken people still deserve a second chance, give it a like and subscribe for more stories that stay with you. Which moment touched you most, and where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments.